Hello there, and welcome back to the Disconnected. I am live here with Troy Howarth, somebody that everybody's heard his name when you're watching a channel like this. Troy, thanks for making time for us tonight.
Well, thank you for having me.
Especially lately, it seems like your name's coming up a lot more on commentaries. Feels like you're beefing those up. Is that something that you're noticing a big uptick for? Especially, it seems like you and Nathaniel are doing a lot together lately.
It's been pretty steady actually over the last several years. It started at the end of 2015, and it took a little while for it to build a little momentum. So I'd say probably since 2017, it's been fairly steady. Nathaniel and I started working together back in 2019, which seems like forever ago. Up until then, I'd always worked alone. But fortunately with him and several other people I've worked with too, I found a good rapport. Makes them more entertaining to do. So yeah, there's been a lot, and I'm sure there's a lot of people groaning and saying, "Oh God, not him again! Can't we get somebody else?" Which, fair enough. There's plenty of voices out there, and they should all be heard.
I agree with the diversity, but I will push back on your voice being boring because it seems like you, especially when you and Nathaniel lately have been together, I don't know, there's something special about that chemistry. It's sort of magnetic, something that feels like you are learning from people that you are just hanging out with. It's basically just chill time with smart friends.
Well, I don't know about the smart part, but it is designed to be conversational and hopefully, yeah, your description is pretty much that's all the more we could hope for. I don't like commentaries that feel like lectures. I don't like when they get very sort of dry and pseudo intellectual and so forth. I mean, everybody has their approach, and I just from somebody starting to listen to commentaries all the way back in the 90s, kind of figured out what I like and what I don't like. And yeah, that's always been the goal, is to try and make it hopefully partly entertainment as well as hopefully somewhat educational. I mean, you can't make everybody happy though.
That's true. That's true. A lot of people really want that dry educational aspect, but I'm just glad that a lot of the current ones that are getting more attention aren't just pointing out what's happening in the movie.
Yeah, those are bad, aren't they? I mean, I think a little bit of that is sometimes okay, just especially when you're working alone, it can be a challenge. So sometimes you need that little bridge to get you from one thought to another, and you say, well, now John Saxon walks across the piazza. You can do that, but if you do that the whole way through and you start doing, oh, don't open that door, girl, stuff like that, it gets really irritating really quick.
Who are some of your favorite commentators to listen to?
Uh, well, I've always enjoyed. You're putting me on the spot here. I'll tell you, some of my favorites are Greg Mank, who's done a lot of the Universal classic horror films. I've always enjoyed his commentaries very much. Christopher Frayling, who sort of specializes in Sergio Leone, although he's done other things as well, but he's always great fun to listen to, very educational. Jonathan Rigby, I like very much. You'll hear him on a lot of, especially British films, Hammer films, things of that
Yeah.
ilk. He's kind of the gold standard. Um, who else? David Callett, who tends to do more kind of German films and silent films and so forth. You might have heard him like on Dr. Mabusa, for example, some of the Fritz Lang films. He's always good to listen to. I'm sure there's some others that are kind of escaping me right now, but I always like Kim Newman. Kim Newman seems to be kind of uh, love him or hate him kind of proposition for some people. I enjoy him though. I think he's very funny, um, and but also quite interesting, and he's able to sort of tap into a variety of different topics. So I always enjoy him very much as well. And you get into someone like the noir commentators like Imogen Sarah Smith. I like her very much. She has a wonderful voice and is very, very articulate, very interesting to listen to. And Alan K. Rody and Eddie Miller and so forth. So there's a bunch, and so obviously as far as directors go, I mean there's a bunch there that I really like listening to as well.
Yeah, and I love hearing so many names because it really shows how rich this hobby can be. It's certainly not a one man show or anything like that, because really you can ask a lot of people who buy a lot of these discs and you can get five different answers and feel that they're all valid easily.
Yeah, I that's why I don't object personally to multiple commentaries on discs, because I think it's
Yeah.
good to have options. Somebody may not like listening to me, but they might like listening to somebody else, or vice versa. There's also the danger sometimes of kind of monopolizing certain subjects, which has happened traditionally with certain people.
Yeah.
Um, I suppose I'm in danger of monopolizing Dario Argento and Lucio Fulci, and I'd hate for that to happen. Although I know other people have done them, so that makes me feel a little bit better. Um, but I mean, but on the other hand, sometimes it's tough. I mean, you get somebody like Paul Talbot, who, when it comes to Charles Bronson, you can't do any better than Paul Talbot. I mean, he knows his stuff. I mentioned
And he
Christopher
literally
Fralin.
wrote the book too.
He did, well, several books at this point, and he's great to listen to. Christopher Fralin, I mentioned. I mean, you can't do better than that when it comes to talking about Sergio Leone. Although I like Alex Cox as well. Um, but it's nice to have some variety, and I think it's a good idea when they do that. I've been asked before, sometimes, on certain releases, "Oh, do you mind if there's another?" No, not at all. So it shouldn't be a competition to me. It's all about more bang for the buck, and the kind of the real enthusiasts, they tend to like to listen to multiple tracks if they're available to. Some people don't listen to any of them. That's fair enough
Right.
too.
Yeah, and there's some of these newer films that are not newer films, but newer releases that are getting sometimes 3 commentaries, and it's always nice to see the variety there because usually when that happens, it's not even the same style, it's not the same topics that they go over. There's just so much to glean from some of these films, especially the ones that have had wide sweeping impacts, and it's just nice to hear.
Yeah, three might be gilding the lily a little bit sometimes. I know there was a release I was going to be involved in, and there was some mix up, and there was, I had an option to be the third, and I said, that's probably too much. I'll skip this one. But two certainly is always advisable. Sometimes you can get away with three. I mean, it just really depends. Some films really they're important enough, and they have enough. And as you say, it doesn't really matter. I mean, there's going to be crossover. That's why it's nice to know if there is going to be somebody else. That way, if you're on speaking terms with them, if you know them or whatever, you can kind of coordinate and say, well, what are you, planning to talk about? I'll try to avoid this. Maybe you can try to avoid that. But
Right.
there's going to be crossover, and it's okay. Everybody's going to approach it differently. My approach is radically different from whoever else you care to mention, and that's as it should be.
And then on top of that, there are, there's certain films that have these random stories, like City of the Living Dead. Everybody knows the random, these are real cow intestines or whatever you're going to say in different scenes. So yeah, I imagine there are a couple stories that are going to get copied. But you brought up Paul Talbot writing the book and how you've been monopolizing Fulci and Argento, but when you've also written the book, here are 3 of Troy's books on Giallo. We're going to be talking about Giallo in just a little bit. That makes sense for you to sort of monopolize those a little bit. So what got you into Giallo originally?
Well, funnily enough, I saw my first Giallo films before I knew what a Giallo was. I mean, in the '80s, growing up in a small town in Pennsylvania, you were kind of limited to what was either on the video shelves or what was on TV, and
Right.
they did run some weird movies late night on Channel 9, including The Night Evelyn Came Out of the Grave, which was the very first commentary I ever did, and probably the first Giallo I ever saw. Phenomena,
Wow.
Creepers would have been one of the early ones too. That was a very early commentary for me as well.
I
So
love I'm wearing that shirt as you mentioned
there
it.
you go. Yeah. Um, I mean, it all kind of goes back to Mario Bava for me, becoming a fan of Bava by way of Baron Blood, seeing it when I was very, very young. Um, and kind of realizing there was something different about it. I couldn't articulate what or why or how at that time because I'm just a little kid. I mean, I'm less than 10 years old. I was probably
Right.
closer to 5 or 6. And it was, there was just something different about the different feel of it, the different look of it. It just had it had a flavor that was unique and that stuck with me. And gradually, I started seeing some of those other films as well, and realizing there's something a little bit funky and weird about some of these movies, like the music and the voices are a little strange, and it eventually started to figure that out. And I did see in Phil Hardy's Encyclopedia of Horror Films, which is one of my kind of seminal books, that made me want to write about movies. he would refer to Giallo every now and again. I was like, Giallo, what is that? What is that supposed to mean? And I eventually came to realize that it was this kind of brand of Italian thrillers that are very sort of lurid, pulpy, and not always especially violent. I mean, sometimes they're more psychological than they are violent, but that was kind of a path eventually I started getting into through Bava's films and Argento and Fulci, and realizing this is really interesting stuff. And then just from there, starting to seek out everything that I could, and started to think about the idea of maybe writing a book that kind of cataloged all the films, because there had been not terribly in-depth book from, I guess, the 90s. I believe it was called Blood and Black Lace, which was kind of a review book. But it seemed to me it was a little bit incomplete. It was certainly out of date at that time, and it seemed like the reviews were fairly sort of short. I thought it might be interesting to go back and do something a little bit more in depth. But now, here we are coming into 2023 soon, and which is like 10 years after I started it. And I think to myself, I'd like to do it over again. If I could, I'd like to go back and redo it and revise it and revamp it. Maybe I will someday. I don't know.
Interesting. Me personally, I love everything I've read through all three of these. I've taken so many notes, discovered multiple films. They are incredible. Giallo is something that really hits people differently, and there's something about the way that they're written about in these that it sort of gives that tone that certain films are talked about different ways, and that it's hard to explain, but they really, it's not just the tone or what necessarily is in the film, but they just speak to different generations differently when you go back and watch them with different experiences. And it's nice to see somebody like you that gives a very neutral voice to something like Giallo, because they have so much behind them that a lot of the time, if you're just trying to educate on them, they kind of speak for themselves.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said there. I mean, for one thing, they're movies that don't play really well for people who are really married to the kind of British and American style of murder mysteries. They don't always play fair logically. I've always said they kind of make emotional sense rather than they make logical sense. If you're really concerned with all the loose ends getting gathered up and tied up in a neat bow at the end, go watch Agatha Christie. Go watch, not it was Alfred Hitchcock. Funnily enough, Hitchcock's films aren't always as logical as all that. Vertigo's a terribly illogical movie when you think about it. But a lot of his films tend to be, and they tend to focus more on the story and the plot. The plot's very important. Whereas with Giallo films, it's more about the set pieces. It's more about going for very specific effects and so forth. And again, there are different types of Gialli. Some people think that all Giallo films are just about men running around in black trench coats with black gloves slicing up beautiful women. Right. And that is true that there's a lot of those, but there's a lot of other types of films too, the kind of cosmopolitan, sexy Gialli, for example, with these impossibly good-looking people lounging around swimming pools and bored with their lives and being absolutely hideous to one another and plotting against each other. So there's all kinds of different things. There are hybrids, the Polizieski that became very popular in the 60s and 70s, kind of fuses with the Giallo at one point. There are Western Gialli. I mean, I included some in my book. But, you could even make a case for a couple of films like Once Upon a Time in the West and For a Few Dollars More as well that have Giallo elements in them, definitely. And hell, even after a certain point, they got so desperate that there's porno Gialli as well. Get things like Play Motel and Giallo in Venice and so forth, and even more extreme examples than that. So yeah, it's a wide palette, and it doesn't do to take them all terribly seriously. Some of them are quite interesting, and they're made by directors who have a real vision and have a real kind of artistic intention, and some of them are just garbage. I mean, some of the garbage is fun, some of it's not. Some of the films are really, really bad. And that was funny. I don't seek out reviews of my books because it just doesn't pay to do that. But
Never.
Somebody pointed out a review to me one time, and they one of the books on Amazon, which is kind of a cesspool because anybody can go on there and say whatever they want to say, and it doesn't even have to be a review. They'll just put up and say, this guy sucks, and they leave it up. It doesn't have anything to do with anything. But it was kind of complimentary, but at the same time saying, this guy he's too negative about too many of the films. Like, what the hell do you want? I mean, you're talking about hundreds of films. Some of them are awful. I mean, I'm
Right.
sorry. It doesn't mean you have to turn in your fan card just because you don't like all of them. So, yeah, it is what it is.
There are a lot of people that just spend a lot of time complaining about people being positive on films too, which
Yeah.
I always laugh at. But a lot of times, people just choose to talk about what they like. So if you're doing a real deep dive, and I mean, three big books about Giallo, that's a deep dive. There's going to be some trash in there.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't have wasted all that time if I didn't like them.
Right.
There is such a thing as toxic positivity. I see this sometimes with particularly horror fans who say we've got to support this film because we've got to support the genre. To
Right.
which I say, to hell with that. That's ridiculous because they're a bad horror film. They're bad films in any genre. So it doesn't mean that you have to like everything. You don't have to like everything that Dario Argento ever made to be a fan. It's okay to say Dracula 3D sucks because it does. At least from my point of view, some people do like it. Um, but it is a matter of opinion, and I did talk about this recently. I put something up on Facebook about these people who sort of contort themselves into pretzels and try to somehow invalidate opinions of other people and saying you've got it wrong. You're wrong to not like this movie, or you're wrong to like it. Who cares? Just if you
Right.
like it, then be happy with that. You don't need validation. You don't need other people to agree with you. If you like it, it worked for you.
Yeah, that's that would solve a lot of arguments right there. That I've got a lot I want to say about that, but man, that was just kind of a perfect statement. I'll let that sit. You brought up Fulci, you brought up Argento. What are some more of your favorite directors?
Oh boy, there's so many. I mean, Mario Bava is number one for me. He's the king.
Yeah,
Dario Argento, of course, Fulci, Roman Polanski, canceled, I know, but I love his movies. I think the man's a genius. Whatever one thinks of him as a human being, whatever, but his films are extraordinary. Scorsese, um, Werner Herzog, William Friedkin, Fritz Lang, Michael Powell, Alfred Hitchcock, Terence Fisher. Um, God Almighty! I mean, I'm sitting here with all these reference books. Billy Wilder,
mm,
Stanley Kubrick. Yeah, I mean the list just goes on and on and on. Sidney Lumet would be another one. Coppola, at least through the '70s, and it's choppier after that, but
of
certainly
course.
the '70s was pretty amazing. Yeah, I mean a ton. Jean-Pierre Melville would be another one. I really love his films. Park Chan-wook, I love
Oh
his work
God,
as
yeah.
well. Yeah, lots of good stuff.
I just saw Thirst for the first time, and my God, that
Oh,
is such a unique movie.
yeah, that's good. Well, all of
Uh,
his films are. I haven't seen his newest one yet, but I'm sure it's good. I mean, everything else has been. It would be hard to believe that he would all of a sudden make a lousy movie, but it could happen, I suppose.
he is
Um,
one. I don't think there's a single thing that I've even felt any sort of negative feelings about.
no, I've liked them all. I mean, not to the same extent. Some of them I like a little
Right.
less than others. But even something that is sort of a weird film like I'm a Cyborg and That's Okay is a really charming little movie. I mean, it's different than the other ones. It's slighter perhaps, but it's an endearing film. I kind of feel the same way about Polanski. I mean, he's been making films now for 60 years, and he's yet to make one that I think is a truly bad movie. Some of them I like less than others, but even a little weird movie like What, which many people kind of throw aside like it's garbage. I think it's a really good movie.
Right.
Um, so yeah, I certainly admire people who are able to sustain that level of quality over that length of a period of time. That's pretty rare because most people at some point or another can end up making a bad movie. It ends up happening.
Well, not only period of time, but genres too, because Polanski and a handful of others, they've like De Palma's kind of the perfect example of this. That De Palma's made basically an incredible movie in almost every single genre.
Yeah,
It's so hard to transcend that type of thing, and it's really nice to reflect on somebody that can do it properly.
yeah. I mean, you get somebody like Dario Argento who was a specialist, and he's pretty much stayed within that wheelhouse for his career, and has had a certain degree of success. It's gotten a little choppier lately, but for a long time maintained a certain degree of success. Leone was another one. Obviously, Sergio Leone, pretty much stayed with westerns for
Hmm.
most of his career, although he ends his career with a great gangster film. So there's, obviously he had talents that went beyond that. People tend to think of Scorsese as the mob guy, but I mean, he also made The Age of Innocence, Last Temptation of Christ, King of Comedy. I mean, all these different films,
Oh
great
yeah.
films in different genres. Fulci was a very eclectic filmmaker. He made movies in just about all the different genres and did very well by them. Umberto Lenzi, who isn't quite on the same tier as some of them, but still a director I like very much. Obviously, I spent a long time writing about him as well. Is another guy who went from genre to genre and did very well. Bava did too, with the exception of the Western. The Western was the one genre that really he kind of didn't do so good at. I wouldn't necessarily say completely failed, but didn't do nearly as well there for reasons that really kind of make sense when you think about it. But other than that, going into different types of films and so forth did really well. So I admire that type of eclecticism very much.
Yeah, me too. You finally brought up Lenzi. Why don't we spend some time talking about Make Them Die Slowly? This is a brand new book that you literally just released. God, what is the official release date on this? Like 2.5, 3 weeks ago, something?
Yeah, about that.
It is so far really nice. This edition, especially, it's the hardcover color pages. A beautiful book, by the way. It's an incredible feat to get something
Thank
like
you.
this out in 2022. I would say.
Well, the aesthetic aspect of it, you got to give a lot of credit to Tony Strauss at WK Books, who did the layout, did the design, and he just, he's phenomenal. Every time I've worked with him on a book has been a joy. It's a fun process working with him because he's got a very good eye, very good sensibility, and he really knows how to make me look good. But yeah, I mean, that was an interesting project for me because, as I talked about in the book, at one point, if he ever would have said to me, "You're going to write a book about Lenzi," I would have laughed at the idea because for years I really didn't take him seriously at all.
Yeah.
I formed an impression of him as this sort of obnoxious old curmudgeon in sweaters who just always talked about what a genius he was and made kind of hacky movies. I didn't realize for years how good a lot of his films really were. And part of that was being introduced to some of the weaker later films that came in the 80s, which is not the ideal way to be introduced to Lenzi's work, and also bad transfers. So you didn't really get to appreciate the aesthetic quality that he brought to his films. He was a very good craftsman.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, when I finally started having to kind of think about his work a little more seriously doing commentaries, because it just so happened I was hired to do a lot of Lenzi commentaries, I started to realize, there's something here that could be interesting. And there hadn't been a book written about him in English. Um, he's obviously very popular among the Italian genre fans. So I thought, well, I mean, it might as well be me. Nobody else has done it. So I'll go ahead and throw my hat into the ring and write a book about Lenzi. Hopefully not the only book. I'm hoping other people will follow. But it was a fun project to do.
How much time do you spend working on this one?
Oh, it's hard to say altogether. I mean, I feel like from the time I started until the time it came out, probably about a year and a half, which is not really that much time, really, when you think about it, the amount of work that went into it.
Yeah.
But part of it is because um, I should preface this by saying I do have a day job, so I can't just sit home and write and watch movies all the time. I wish I could, but I've got to go to a day job and then you come home and you're tired and everything. But when I get working on a project, I'm always terrified that I'm going to lose momentum. So I just keep going at it day after day after day after day. Got to keep writing. I don't care how much you get done. You got to get something done in the day in order to keep it going. Because if you stop, there's always that potential you'll just lose it and you won't be able to get it back. So that was pretty intense, concentrated work over that period of time. It helped too that I had Eugenio Ercolani, who you've had on your show, involved. He wrote a lovely foreword because he knew Lenzi very well, interviewing him. As a matter of fact, that's why I contacted him, because his book, Darkening the Italian Screen, has the best Lenzi interview you're ever going to read in your life. I mean, it is a full tilt, no holds barred. Umberto really just vomiting forth in great detail. And I thought, God, this is great. And I didn't really know Eugenio at that time, but I knew I was going to lean heavily on that interview. So I thought I better get his. I mean, you don't have to because it's published, it's out there. As long as you're citing it, it's fair.
Right.
But when you're going to lean heavily on something like that, if I can, I like to try and contact the person and say, hey, I'm going to use this lot. Do you mind? Do you object to this? And of course, he said, no, that's perfectly fine. And he was able to help out a lot. Federico Cadeo, whose name you'll know too from extras. Um, I think he runs Frico Rama Productions. You'll see their interviews on a lot of Blu-ray releases. He had a lot of material too, especially pictures. So got a lot of great behind-the-scenes pictures and rare shots that were a great addition to the book.
And we're finally getting good releases of Lindsay's films. It was kind of lagging there for a while, but you brought up transfers. It is unreal in 2022 the way that some of these films can be viewed. We just had a conversation about this recently, how it seems that many of these films are playing better than they've ever played, even in a theater, in home theaters across the world right now, because 4K scans are better than some old dim bulb in some Washington D.C. theater. What are some of the most remarkable upgrades you've seen recently that have been just beyond impressive?
Oh, right, boy,
I know that's an intimidating question.
That's a tough one to answer. I only just recently went to 4K myself, for years saying I wasn't going to do it. Of course, inevitably I did. And the reason I did was because I got hired to do a commentary for Deep Red, which is one of my all-time favorite films. And they put it out only in 4K. And I was like, well, I guess I have to do it now. Not just because of the obvious, because I don't really listen to my own stuff. I don't know. I don't particularly, I'll maybe listen to a little bit, but I'm not going to sit there, like Norma Desmond, reliving my former glories. But because it's Deep Red, I was like, well, I've got to see what this looks like, because they did a new scan and everything. I'll tell you what, the Synapse Suspiria, which I was also happy to be a part of, that's an amazing looking transfer. If you get a chance to see that, 4K, that is really absolutely a sort of mind-melting experience in its own right. Some wonderful stuff with black and white movies too, like The Apartment. Billy Wilder's The Apartment looks fantastic. Really, really happy with that. And, some of the John Carpenter stuff that's been upgraded as well. But also, I think by far the best, the most satisfying home video release ever of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly from Kino, where they finally got it looking correct. It doesn't have that sort of ugly tint, yellow tint that it had for a while. And along the same lines, their new version of Fistful of Dollars was just amazing as well, because that last Blu-ray they put out was hot garbage. It looked awful. I got rid of it. I was so disappointed when I watched it. I thought this looked terrible. But the 4K looks absolutely amazing.
I've been very happy with Kino. It seems like since about 2018, 2019, they started to really listen to feedback, and they've come around to just suddenly being this powerhouse. It's astonishing to me that they can release like 5 movies a week, and somehow 3 of those will be great releases of films. And it's not 2014 anymore, where they would just put out a film with a trailer and call it good. They'll put out a film with a commentary and maybe 1 or 2 other things, and then on top of that, 3 months later, it'll be on sale for $8.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, there are a lot of really good labels now, which, I'm gonna go there. I'm gonna say it. I think some people think this. They don't want to say it. I really think Criterion's been coasting for years at this point. Everybody gets so, it's, I hope they put this out on Criterion. Why?
Right.
It's already got a fantastic edition from. Why do you need it? But there's these people who have this. It's kind of like the name value, and they earned that for years. Going back in the 90s and so forth. But lately, I don't know, they put out some very flawed discs, and when they upgrade their movies to 4K, they're not adding new features. They're not doing anything really different with it.
Right.
I mean, don't get me wrong, they've done some amazing work. I love their release of Night of the Living Dead, for example. I thought that was, an amazing release, but they ain't all cracked up to be these days, in my opinion, anyway. Whereas you look at some of these other boutique labels, like 88 has been doing amazing work lately. Arrow, obviously, made leaps and bounds over their early stuff too.
Certainly.
Synapse, Blue Underground, and so forth. I mean, Criterion, it's always going to have that cachet, I suppose, because it has that kind of name value to it. It's like Nike or Adidas or something. It just has that, that special something. But man, from my point of view, I think they've been eclipsed by some of these other labels.
I agree fully. Especially prior to 2022, I've been saying since about 2016 17 or 18 that they're just not what they used to be. A lot of the stuff this year, the titles got me, but then they are coasting with the features again. And uh, yeah, the 4K re-releases are nice to see some of these in the highest quality, but like you said, it's like Scream Factory. When you're putting out a 4K of something that you put out previously, at least give the fans something. And I get it. A lot of the people involved are either dead or dying. But there's like 55 people we can name right now that would be more than willing to do a new commentary for something.
Well, they seem to have kind of a good old boys club going there as far as contributors are concerned. It's very tough to get involved. I've not tried, and I'm not saying this out of bitterness or anything. I'd love to do something for them if they ever had an interest. They're not going to ask me,
right?
But if they ever did, sure, I mean, that'd be great. But there are all kinds of people. I mean, this is not a small field anymore. There's a lot of people jostling around looking for jobs, and you know, I think they would be spoiled for choice. It would be, I think, really, really worthwhile to get somebody in to do a I mean, okay, they put out Raging Bull on 4K last year, and they did a very nice job with it. It's got some nice features on it, and it's a beautiful transfer. But it would have been really nice if they could have gotten somebody, somebody interesting to go and do a commentary on a film like that. Kind of delve into it, talk about it, and so forth. But they don't seem to be interested in doing that. What really disappoints me is when they get some, an old catalog title like Tunes of Glory, a really wonderful British film with John Mills and Alec Guinness and Dennis Price, which is, it's another one of those movies. Everybody's dead, obviously. They're not going to get anybody connected to the film with it. But they only ever had like a 5-minute long interview with the director and a poster and still gallery, and that's all the more it's still got. It's like, why didn't you add something in? Put a commentary or something. But I don't, the people who are married to Criterion will be just absolutely cursing my name for saying this because, of course, they can do no wrong. But they've put out some very compromised editions. There's been a lot of controversy over color timing on some of their releases and things. Dress to Kill was notoriously kind of botched initially, and every label has their mistakes. But you kind of hold Criterion to a higher standard. It's sort of surprising when sometimes you hear underwhelming things about their releases. I feel like, again, they seem to be slightly coasting a little bit.
I can't remember who it was. Somebody from Arrow, I think it was about a year and a half ago, said that some of these color timing questions with directors are directors coming in and saying something different about their films. What I've suggested, just put out both versions if possible. I mean, a lot of us, they grew up with these discs for 40 years, seeing it one way. And if something comes out looking completely differently tinted, sure, the director may like it, but what about the rest of the world that viewed this as something different?
Yeah, it's revisionism, and it's something that I've always respected Scorsese for refusing to sort of tinker with his films, with the exception of New York, New York, which I think I understand why he did that, because he was a mess when he made it, and the studio kind of tampered with it and everything. So he kind of went back with a clear head and was able to fix stuff with it. But even a movie like Gangs in New York, which we know was heavily compromised and material was cut and everything, he won't touch it. He said, no, it's my film. I agreed to this version. It's the way it's going to stay. But you get people like Coppola and James Cameron and Ridley Scott and Michael Mann, and they love to go back, and George Lucas, of course, famously, tinkering with their films. And I don't have a problem with it, but they should preserve the original version as well as the new version. I think that's perfectly fine. I mean, Coppola going back and changing the Cotton Club and the Godfather 3 were improvements, definitely. He definitely made those into better, more coherent and cohesive films. And I know that The Godfather Part 3 is available in its original version as well. I don't know if the Cotton Club really is or not, but it's nice when they make both versions available. But of course, William Friedkin is really well known for loving to tinker with the colors and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And I say let him tinker with it, but put, as you say, both versions on there. So you can have a version of Cruising that's really very blue, but let's have the version that we're familiar with, the way it was originally shown as well. French Connection, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's perfectly fine. Or you have a really weird situation of something like Alien, which the theatrical cut is the director's cut. Ridley Scott has said this many times. That is his cut. The version that sold as a director's cut on video is not his preferred version. That was just something he did to kind of appease the fans, add in a little bit of footage and take some footage out. It more or less runs the same running time. But they put in that scene with Tom Skerritt in the cocoon and all that stuff, and they sort of shortened some other bits and so forth. It's not really a director's cut. The Exorcist, the 2000 version, which I in many respects don't like, was really something he did to appease William Peter Blatty, who had for years complained about all these things in the film he didn't like. So he kind of did this to shut him up. But now he's like, oh yeah, that's my cut of the movie. Well, wait a minute. The 73 version's better. So all these kinds of things, this kind of revisionism and so forth, as long as the directors are doing it, I don't have a problem with it, but they should preserve the original version that we're familiar with as well.
And the hardest part for me is that there are some of these instances, and not to just continue shitting on Criterion or anything, but their Miller's Crossing disc is kind of the biggest example of that recently. They took it's not a lot, but it's like 75 seconds worth of footage out because the directors said that they wanted it cut from the film.
Yeah.
That's not the same movie though. It's something completely different. And I'm really against censorship altogether. We got to be able to at least archive what we all knew so that we can have that history.
Yeah, I mean, even sort of bastardized versions that were put out by the studio against the wishes of the director, I think should be preserved just for comparative purposes. Growing up in the 80s, the version of the Fearless Vampire Killers that I knew and fell in love with does not exist anymore. It was the version that Martin Ransohoff had completely overhauled and cut and redubbed it and tinkered with extensively. It's vastly inferior to Polanski's version, but I'd love to see it again. With the animated cartoon prologue and everything in it that they put in, and they kind of added all these silly sound effects and changed the voices and things. It's definitely a travesty, but I think it should be preserved just because, I think for the sake of sort of further research, you should be able to have access to it. That was one thing that I was happy about when Nathaniel and I did a commentary for Jess Franco's film Justine. This was just announced today.
Yep.
The specs were announced today anyway. And as part of the commentary, we were talking about this shorter version of the film that was available for years called Deadly Sanctuary. And you never know whether these companies actually even listen to commentary tracks sometimes. I think they just take them and they slap on a disc and whatever. But these guys listen because they realized, oh, that would be an interesting extra feature to have. So they are now presenting Deadly Sanctuary as an extra on the disc for the first time ever. So I think that's really great.
That's how you do it. I mean, listen to that. It's not something, especially with a lot of people don't know what it's called, but seamless branching on these 4K discs is where they take all the same footage that is in one version and utilize it for multiple versions of the same film, so you don't compromise the integrity of the compression levels or anything like that on the disc. And they unfortunately they have limited space they can put on these discs, and if they had to do that, I could see it being a problem. But with that, I mean, Blue Underground is the epitome of high quality on 4Ks. I don't know how many you've seen yet, but their 4Ks are mind-blowing.
I've seen several. I mean, I've been fortunate enough to be involved in several, and I've got more coming. They're great. I mean, I'm absolutely thrilled with the way that Zombie looked, for example, and the New York Ripper. Absolutely beautiful. So, that's great when they can do that. Or alternatively, when you have a case like Ruggero Deodato going back and deciding to do an animal cruelty-free version of Cannibal Holocaust, which is fine, but there again, you offer both versions. If you use seamless branching or whatever, or do 2 discs or whatever you need to do, as long as you're presenting it in a kind of a good way like that, and allowing people to have the option to see which version they want to see, which version they prefer, that's the way it should be.
I completely agree. In terms of censorship, I didn't really plan on bringing this up, but we brought up Polanski for a minute. It sounds like you feel a lot of the same way about this whole cancel culture idea that I do. I'm curious, just so we could try to share with everybody, how do you try to separate the art from the artist?
Yeah, well, cancel culture, it's a difficult thing to get into talking about because you sound like a right-winger, and I'm certainly not that. Um, there, I've always maintained that art has no moral obligations whatsoever. I think
Bingo.
the only sin art can commit is to be boring. So that's a very subjective thing. You look at a film, you look at a painting, you listen to a piece of music, and respond to it or you don't. You like it or you don't.
Yep.
You either have the ability to articulate why you like it or don't like it, or you don't. This is where you see online some people writing lengthy dissertations versus some people just saying it sucks.
Yeah.
It's both reactions are valid, but some people can get a little deeper than others. Some people don't seem to have those skills. When it comes to artists, I mean, Polanski's certainly an example. Klaus Kinski's an even greater example. I mean, there's a lot of stories about Klaus Kinski, and if even a fraction of them are true, he was a pretty despicable human being.
Yeah.
However, he was also one of the most compelling screen presences of all time, and I'm not going to throw out my films with him in them because of some of the things they say he did. I don't know that he did all these things. I suspect he did at least some of them. Polanski, certainly there's no ambiguity there. We know what happened, in 1977. It has been dogging him for years. Unfortunately, it resulted in a situation where his last 3 films have not been released over here in any shape whatsoever. You can get them imported if you know where to look, but unfortunately, that means that you're not getting an opportunity to see some really fine films now.
Right.
Whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I mean, that kind of depends on what side of this argument you come down on. But my opinion is basically, if we start looking at art as if it needs to be created by nice people, we're going to be getting rid of a lot of the best art ever created. Because some of the best art ever created has been made by really awful people. I mean, go back even painting,
Right.
Literature, music, you name it. We have to get rid of everything that Richard Wagner ever wrote. So many different examples down through the years of people who are, what is the word? I can't think of the word now. Not compromised, but complicated, I guess, in the contemporary sense, because they did something that we disapprove of, or something that really isn't even a
problematic is probably what you were thinking of.
Problematic is the word. Yes, thank you. It's kind of ludicrous, really. It's not up to me to pass moral judgment on these people. I'm not interested in having a argument about whether these are good people or bad people. They're great artists. That's what I'm talking about. And their works deserve to be preserved and deserve to be discussed. And people were dismissing Woody Allen based on allegations that have never really been terribly well substantiated. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to think that. I mean, yeah, his relationship with Sun Yi might be strange. I mean, it might have been not the ideal. But she was of age. She was not a blood relative. So I mean, live and let live. I really don't care. If you don't like his movies because you just don't like his movies, that's one thing. But if you're going to adopt this kind of hand-wringing moral outrage over somebody just because they did something you disagree with or said something you disagree with, I mean, there are admittedly people who sometimes are shooting themselves in the foot. I mean, John Cleese has been shooting himself in the foot lately with some of the things he's been saying.
Yeah.
He's starting from a good place, which is talking about the dangers of losing our ability to use humor and satire because we won't engage with certain subjects because we don't want to offend anybody. That's a valid point. But then he's taking it to a degree where he's just starting to sound like a bitter old man, and it's kind of compromising his legacy a little bit. It's like, you're in your 80s, just shut up. Right. You're not helping yourself at this point. You're appealing, if anything, you're appealing to the people that you really don't like, because this is a guy who for years was blasting Trump, which is good in my book. But you're appealing to that kind of person now by arguing against all these sort of woke liberals and everything, trying to cancel everybody and take away our sense of humor and take away our freedom of expression. So you kind of, you're losing the plot a little bit by taking it too far. I don't think it's something that will ever be successfully resolved. It's just, especially now, I think social media has a lot to answer for. I mean, there's there's no good railing against it because it's not going anywhere. I mean, you can't put the genie back in the bottle, but everybody having a platform and everything unfolding in real time and everybody having the ability to comment on things immediately without thinking about it, without letting it sink in, without having that little bit of time to sort of process.
And
Just
many of those being anonymous too.
Anonymous and too immediate, too knee jerk, and everybody just wants to have a hot take, and
Right.
it's created a lot of problems too. So there are these kinds of ridiculous situations that come up. Some of the situations that are brought up are admittedly things that are being said by a very, very small number of people that somebody reads about and they think, oh my God, all these lefties want to do this. No, not everybody on the left wants this, just a few
Right.
people. So it all just becomes terribly muddy and terribly, everybody just shouting over each other and wanting to kind of virtue signal all the time about, I refuse to support this artist because I
Yeah.
respect women. Well, I respect women too, but I also happen to love Roman Polanski movies. So I'm sorry that what he did is not what I'm celebrating. So I think those things have to be sort of separated.
I agree. And there's a lot of times that's even come up recently. Like Kino just put out a 4K of The Usual Suspects, and
Yes.
I've had to remind people, like, you're not a bad person for liking a film that Kevin Spacey was in. It's not like you watching that in 2022 means that you are morally reprehensible or anything.
You also have to bear in mind that films are made by hundreds of people, sometimes thousands of
Exactly.
people. And it is terribly unfair to suppress or somehow try to remove the efforts of all these people just because of the actions of one. If you went to every single company it, across the globe, every single manufacturer, every single publishing house, etc., whatever it is, you're going to run into problematic people in every
Oh yeah.
single place. What do? Just shut everything down? There's only so much you can police. Allegations that were made against Kevin Spacey, which again may or may not be true. I gather they recently were dismissed. The case was decided in his favor. That he was on trial for. It's not for me to get into it. It doesn't interest me. I happen to think he's a good actor. He's not one of my top 10 favorites or anything, but I've
Right.
always enjoyed watching him. And I'm not going to throw out my copies of Seven or Glenn Ross, or even
Right.
during early his appearance on The Equalizer or his role in See No Evil, Hear No Evil with Gene Wilder and Richard Pryor. I'm not going to get rid of those because of the stories that, or to get rid of films produced by Harvey Weinstein, for example, who is undoubtedly a grade A scumbag. It is what it is. I mean, it's not something that decide. It's the same thing that happened when Trump was in office and Robert De Niro was going on a tear about Trump every chance he got. He was saying fuck Trump and everything else. And all these right wingers were getting really bent out of shape about that, and people saying, "Well, I'm not going to watch any more Robert De Niro movies." Do you think he really cared?
Right.
Do you think it's hurting him that you are getting rid of your copy of Taxi Driver? It's not hurting him one bit. It's kind of a ridiculous knee-jerk thing, and it happens on both sides of the equation. And unfortunately, it doesn't fix the problem. It does nothing to fix the problem. The problem's already it's already happened. It's already done. You're not making anything better by saying, "Well, I refuse to watch anything that so and so has his hand in." Well, okay. I mean, that if that makes you sleep better at night, then that's fine. But I don't see the sense in it.
I agree. And it's not like watching a Kevin Spacey film, even if the allegations are true, it's not like those you watching that film means that somebody else is getting assaulted tomorrow or something. So
No,
it's in the past, it's art, we still have it.
It's like going back and cutting the animal violence out of some of the Italian cannibal movies.
Exactly.
Not going to bring those animals back to life. I don't like that they did that either. It's not something that I personally am a fan of. I love animals. I mean, I'm also a meat eater, so I guess I'm a hypocrite on a certain level. But at least, I mean, I don't kill them myself. I just go to the store and buy them wrapped in plastic and I cook them. But what good does cutting it do? I mean, to remove that footage, what does that do? And it's not something limited to just grubby Italian exploitation films. You could point to scenes in Cat Garrett and Billy the Kid, the Sam Peckinpah movie, for example, or Apocalypse Now. Um, these things happen. Different times, different sensibilities, and that's the other thing too, is the danger of trying to look at old art through a contemporary lens and trying to impose these things on it. Yes, there are certain films from the 30s that are outrageously racist. If you look at The Mask of Fu Manchu, for example, with Boris Karloff, that even by 1932 standards was outrageously racist.
Yep.
But it's so over the top. How could you possibly take it seriously? It's just
Right.
fun. Same token, you could look at the ones that Christopher Lee did in the 60s and say, well, it's still kind of racist, but I mean, Lee's playing it more straight and it's not nearly as cringy. And it doesn't seem to be done with quite that sort of racist sensibility in mind. So it's just something, you just have to put things into a certain context and understand that when certain things were made, it was acceptable. You could get away with it. There are certain things that, you wouldn't get away with today, nor should you get away with today. But you can't impose that on something that was made 50 years ago, 60 years ago, 70 years ago. I remember when I was in college, a friend of mine was dating a girl who was a very, very outspoken feminist. I have no problem with feminists. I want people to understand that. But I thought it was hysterically funny that he said that they watched The Seventh Seal together, and this girl was just absolutely appalled by the way the women were treated in this film. It's set in medieval times.
Right.
This is how it was. You can't make this into an enlightened thing just because that's how it is now. It would be unfair. It would be inaccurate, and it really would grossly distort everything. So,
hell, that would, in my opinion, that'd be more misogynistic. You're erasing the travesties that occurred. At least have them be visible so that we can keep them in mind, so that we can learn from them.
Well, it'd be like suggesting you can't talk about slavery, or you can't talk about any of the other terrible things that have happened. You have to acknowledge these things. You have to be aware that they happen. The best way to ensure that something terrible is going to happen again is to never talk about it.
It's why banning books is so bad.
It's not banning any kind of censorship. I'm not in favor of. I mean, it's just not. Again, it's not addressing the problem. I mean, certain words are not advisable to say. I don't use them myself, but I understand that in a certain context, you can have a racist character without being a racist person yourself. There's racist language in some of Scorsese's films. Does that mean that he is a racist? Absolutely not. But it makes sense for some of the characters that he deals with that are scumbags that they would have these kinds of beliefs. So therefore, they're going to say nasty things, and that's just the way it is.
So that's a damn fine point. The other thing I wanted to point out too is where some of these films are made, because we are watching films in such a global sense now, especially people that are really into home video, that you can't really just brush aside that the Philippines were different in 1960 than the U.S. in 1960, or even something like Germany from a few decades ago, like Necromantic. That movie came out, and there is a rabbit. It's not even like online. It's described as a rabbit torture scene. It's just a rabbit butchering scene. There's not even anything like inhumane about it. They're just butchering a rabbit for food, it looked like. And everybody describes it online as this most horrendous, awful thing, which, it's not fun to watch necessarily, but the movie itself was made to go against censorship.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to fault a film when its objective is really to be disturbing. It's meant to be sort of confrontational. Yep. I mean, I think there's a limit to how much anybody can take. I mean, I remember there was something called August Underground that I saw years ago, and it was. I mean, it's fine for what it is. I mean, if you just want to watch an hour and a half of atrocities, it's fine. I mean, it is successful what it sets out to do. More contemporary example would be a Serbian film, which is. It's quite a well-made movie. I mean, to me, after a certain point, it took on an amazing predictability. I knew where it was going to go because I could just sense you're trying really hard to upset people. So I know where we're going to get to at the end. That's what happened. I mean, to me, after a certain point, it also becomes almost sort of unintentionally funny because it's like it piles on so much that it's too much. But I mean, if a film is really setting out to do that, if that is its MO, then one must accept that and go along for the ride, or else just not watch it. I mean, don't watch Sallow if you have a particularly delicate sensibility, because that movie um, hits you over the head for 2 hours with really harsh imagery. All in the name of decrying fascism. We all know fascism. Well, we don't all know it. Obviously, some people think it's fine. Um, but most of us reasonable people know that fascism is good. But 2 hours being punched in the face and being reminded that fascism is bad. Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what it is, and it's hard to get too worked up about that sometimes. If that's what the filmmaker is trying to do. Sometimes kind of confrontational, nasty, vicious, violent movies work for me, and sometimes they don't.
It's very true. Protest cinema is there and exists for lots of different reasons. Period. So back to Giallo. How about we get into Giallo? We were speaking beforehand of what we want to talk about, and you and I share the sensibility of enjoying a lot of different things. So I was curious what to talk about first, but really the thing that really got me into Troy was these Giallo books, and so I figured why not go back to something that I loved hearing from you about. So I wanted to share with everybody Troy's thoughts on five to get into Giallo if it's your first time or you're getting interested in the genre, and then 5 great deep cuts. So let's go with the intro to Giallo films first. Let's go with your first one.
Well, Blood and Black Lace, Mario Bava. I mean, it's the one that kind of sets the gold standard in many respects. It's the first of the body count gialli. It all kind of goes from there. I mean, there's really not much to be said beyond that. I mean, it is the first film to feature that sort of iconic imagery and the really incredibly intense murder sequences, which are still disturbing because there's a real physicality to them. I think particularly the scene of the girl getting her face smashed against the tree trunk. Really nasty. I mean, it has a real intensity to it. But contrasted with the glamour and the sexiness and the beautiful sort of poetic imagery and so forth, if you really want to get a sense of what a giallo is all about, it's hard to top that one as a primer.
And it's genuinely still such a great film, especially for when it was made. It shines. I'm trying to think. I don't think there's any even current release of that one in print right now. Do you know of any? Because I know the Arrow one went out of print.
Oh, did it? I didn't know that. I know VCI put out a version, but I never looked at it because it's VCI. I'm sorry to say that, but I tend to avoid their discs. I wasn't aware it had gone out of print. Well, hopefully somebody will pick it up and do a nice 4K at some point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think a lot of Bava's films would benefit from 4K and not. When people hear 4K, they just start to think of the resolution. But a lot of these, because of the dark imagery and literally the dark cinematography, that HDR to stop the black banding in the corner of your screen when you're watching on, some shitty LCD panel or something, that's where these are really going to show up and shine for you.
Yeah, it was recently announced. I can say I was absolutely thrilled to do a commentary on The Whip and the Body, another Mario Bava film, one of my great favorites by Bava. For 88 Films, and they went back and did a new scan, which is it's gorgeous. I mean, I've only seen a standard definition, but they finally got it looking right. The previous high def version looked awful. The colors were all wrong. It was far too murky. It was gross. Somehow or another, they got a hold of some materials and did this new transfer. I thought it looked amazing, and I said, "Is this going to be a UHD too?" And they said, "No, we don't think the materials are quite good enough for that." Well. I mean, even in a standard definition version, this thing pops, so I can't wait to see what it looks like on Blu-ray. Bava I think there's only been one UHD release so far. I think there was a French release of Black Sabbath from the Smoking Cat, I believe.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's the only one. Most of Bava's films are controlled by Alfredo Leone, who can be slightly difficult to deal with. So I think, I hope somebody somewhere is going to explore it. They were supposed to do Planet of the Vampires as a UHD. That was my understanding, and then they put it out again on Blu-ray, which made no sense to me whatsoever.
Yeah, same disc as before and everything.
They added a new commentary, not by me.
Well, of the film itself, yes.
Yeah, they did add a new commentary that the old one Tim Lucas had done, and it was a new transfer, I believe, but it was still.
Oh, I may be thinking of one of the other Vincent Price films that they announced. I apologize. Yeah, I might have been thinking of that. They just re-released a couple of the really old Vincent Price ones they did in like 2014 and
Oh
changed
yeah, they've
nothing.
been they've been putting out some of the like the Poe films and Last Man on
Yep.
Earth. I think. Yeah, yeah.
The Bava thing. Speaking of Kino, I think all of their Bava titles were going out of print. I don't know if they're all out now, but the word going behind the scenes is that they might be, or the people who hold the rights might be noticing how much their stuff is in demand and suddenly be charging a lot more for the licenses. So I really hope it's not the end of the home video stuff for a while.
It happens, unfortunately. I mean, I was so impressed that David Gregory was finally able to get Rene Chateau to agree to doing Faceless, because he'd been asking for the Moon and the Stars for ages for that film.
Right.
I mean, some of these people, they ask for, there's a lot of complaints about re-releasing the same films over and over again, and why don't they put out this film, put out that film? There are a lot of reasons for this. One
Yeah.
of them is sometimes the right holders are impossible to deal with. Sometimes the materials just simply aren't there. Sometimes they can't figure out who owns the rights. Some of Lindsay's best films, for example, I've been pushing for releases of from Fully Brooklyn and Violent Naples, and they just can't seem to figure out who owns the rights. I mean, we thought we'd figured out who it was, and it turned out they denied it. So it was like, well, I don't know who owns these
Hmm.
films. So there are certain ones that are just difficult to get access to for that reason. But I also don't object to re-releasing the same films over and over again, as long as you're going to do them better. If you can get a better transfer and hopefully add
Exactly.
in some new extras too, I don't see a problem with that.
All right. What is your second intro to Jolly film?
Um, Deep Red.
Nice choice.
Deep Red is my favorite Giallo. I mean, it's another one. If you really want a sense of what these films are like, what they're all about, it's an ideal primer in many respects. It is probably the most cohesive of Argento's Gialli in many respects. I think he really benefited from the participation of Bernardino Zapponi on the screenplay. Zapponi had worked a lot with Fellini and was great at taking kind of wild ideas and giving them shape and substance, and creating a coherent narrative. So this is one of the movies that actually kind of makes sense. There's still some bits that really don't make a lot of sense. The doll doesn't really make any sense, but I'm glad it's there. So it's okay. And the movie does wander off into the irrational, but that's intentional. So it's not like it's sloppiness. It's an intentional thing that Argento likes to do. I love David Hemmings in it. I love Daria Nicolodi in it. They make such a great couple. And of course, the music by Goblin is just absolutely, mind blowing to this day.
I was fortunate enough about 2.5 weeks ago to see Goblin playing with Suspiria at the local theater here. They played it live. And afterwards, they did like a full hour and 10 show of just other themes, modern music that they've been working on. And when they played Deep Red, it hit so hard live in person. They are special.
Yeah, it's my favorite of the scores they've done, Deep Red, even though it's not entirely theirs, because Giorgio Gasolini was hired to do the
Yep.
score originally, and so some of the music is his. But I love that score. I love the film. I mean, it's just an amazing piece of work. I mean, it's really Argento coming back to the Giallo and saying, I'm going to, make the Giallo to end all Gialli, which I think he did. To me, it's the absolute best that the genre has to offer.
Absolutely. Number 3, then.
Well, I hate to keep with Argento, but I will put number 3 with Bird with the Crystal Plumage, just because I think that's another one that's just a great primer for people. It's another one that actually tells a really kind of gripping, compelling story that essentially makes sense. It follows a nice, coherent through line. It's a little more sort of straightforward and linear than some of his later films. It's a little less eccentric. It has wonderful, wonderful humorous touches in it too. Some of the characters, the stammering pimp, So Long, for example, or Mario Adorf as the cat-eating painter, who's walled himself up in the house and paints mystical scenes because he's feeling mystical. I love that film. It wouldn't, frankly, wouldn't be in my top 10 if I'm making a top 10 list of Giallo films. But I think as intro movies go, that's a really solid place to start.
Did you happen to see Dark Glasses yet?
Yes, I did.
How do you feel about that one?
I think it's the best thing he's done, best feature he's done since the Stendhal Syndrome. I think
Wow.
Stendhal Syndrome is his last great film to date. Um, Dark Glasses is not a great film. It's one of those things. I was talking with somebody recently about the Halloween sequels lately, and I drew this parallel that fans sometimes it's like when you're being fed dog food for years, and all of a sudden you're handed a fatty, overdone, rock hard piece of steak, but it's still steak, and you
Right.
think, this is really good. The new Halloween movies weren't that good, but they're better than the ones that came right before it. Dark Glasses, I wouldn't put down there. I think it's a good film. I think it's a genuinely good film. I did see some of the fans really kind of losing their minds over it, acting like it was, it's not
Right.
that good. It's good. It's a good movie. And for 21st century Argento, that will do. So I like it. I actually do like it. I think it has some really interesting things. I love the relationship between the girl and the little boy, which recalls the relationship between Carl Malden and Cinzia Corellis in Cat of Nine Tails. Um, so it's a movie that has all kinds of callbacks to his earlier films, and it's a slight plot, which is borne out by the fact it's a very short film. It's less than an hour and a half, which
Yeah.
is very short for Argento. Um, but it's got energy, and he shot it in Italian. It's the first movie he shot in Italian since The 5 Days back in 1973, which really helped, I think. So the movie doesn't have that ear splitting issue with some of the voices that I've heard some of the more recent films.
Right. Alrighty. What's your number 4 intro to Giallo movie?
I think another really good intro to Giallo would be Paolo Cavara's film *The Black Belly of the Tarantula* with Giancarlo
Good
Giannini.
choice.
I don't know where that movie is on Blu-ray. Please, somebody make it happen. Invite me along if you wish. I'd love to do it. It has probably Ennio Morricone's best score for a Giallo, which is a big recommendation in and of itself. It has an unusually complex policeman protagonist in the form of Giannini, who's this, if you don't know the name right off the top of your head, he's a brilliant actor, worked a lot with Lena Wertmüller, films like Castaway and Seven Beauties, but more recently you've seen him in things like Hannibal and Casino Royale and so forth. He's one of the great Italian actors. And it is one of those movies with the killer in black slicing up gorgeous women. So it is kind of a classic example. It's very much a imitation of what was going on with Argento's films at that time, but it's a really, really good imitation. And I think a movie that ticks off all those boxes. If you're looking for something that really gives you a sense of what a Giallo is all about, which is what I'm trying to limit myself to with these ones, I think that's a good example.
Yeah, and I think for the people that are trying to get into the genre, that's got to kind of be where you start. Is what are the quintessential this is what it's all about type of titles. And so far these 4 have nailed it. Eager to see your 5th one here. So what is number 5 then?
Number 5, I could go in a couple of different directions, but I feel like I need to have Fulci here, and I think for a kind of classic representation, you would be hard pressed to do better than Elizabeth in Woman's Skin. One of his best films, great cast. I mean, really, really distinguished actors in it, like Stanley Baker and Leo Genn. In addition to the more familiar Giallo faces like Anita Strindberg and Jean Sorel. Another great Morricone score, trippy imagery, Francis Bacon-inspired dream sequences. There's an animated bird at one point. It's like something out of the Alfred Hitchcock, Salvador Dali dream sequence in Spellbound. Lesbianism, lots of blood, hippies. What else could you ask for? I mean, it's just a great little montage with Leo Genn and his family sort of having dinner, very stuffy, buttoned down. Leo Genn complaining about, those neighbors next door making all that racket, and they're having an orgy next door and smoking pot. Oh, it's just great. It's great stuff.
It is really great Blu-ray out from Mondo Macabro on this one.
Yeah.
This is yet another one I think would do very well on 4K, especially with Fulci's. I don't know. There's something about his cinematography that just begs you to pause every scene and digest it in, because he has such an eye for like his angles are just one of a kind on most of his films. Like Don't Torture a Duckling. I don't know if that's going to be a part of the other top 5, but that movie is astonishing for for every single scene that you pause and just look at every corner and go, he knew what he was doing in every single shot.
Yeah, it mystifies me when people dismiss him as a hack because I suspect it's because of some of the later films. The later films were heavily compromised, A, by his own health, B, by the budgets. I mean, he just wasn't capable at that point of getting the same results. Although they're better films than they're often given credit for, the later movies, I tend to like them more than most people do. But if you look at his stuff in the 60s and 70s and into the 80s, he was doing things that Brian De Palma got a lot of credit for later, using split screen, split diopter, things like that, especially in Lizard and a Woman's Skin, but also in Perversion Story, which was his first Giallo from 1969. Really, really cutting edge stuff, really inventive, dynamic filmmaking. And another man who just, had boundless talent. He made great westerns. He did one, Poliziesco, but it was a really good one. Did some good comedies. He did some good action movies. I mean, he did a little bit of everything and did them really, really well.
Since we get on his subject for a moment, I'm curious. Obviously, Severin is diving deep into Franco, and Mondo Macabro has done a few. Fulci's kind of similar in a lot of aspects to Franco's output, at least. Do you think there's a chance anytime soon that we get to see any of those early Fulci comedies on Blu-ray? Because I don't think anybody's diving whatever into any of those movies yet.
It would sell great for like 3 people. I think you and me and Nathaniel Thompson, we would buy them. I don't know if anybody else would. I would love to see it happen. Nathaniel and I have talked about this before because there are other directors too, like Massimo Dallamano, and there's some lesser known films that he did, like The End of Innocence, for example, or Innocence and Desire. I'm like, I'd love to see that put out. No. I don't know, but you say that, and Severin's got the 5 days coming out, not just on Blu-ray, but on a 4K UHD. Now that you could have knocked me over with a feather. I thought they were just doing Blu-ray. I had no idea they were going in. Well, go big or go home. I'd love to see it happen. I think they should absolutely do a box set of Fulci comedies. Companies like Severin, as they are releasing more and more box sets that are intriguing people and buying them and so forth, they might be able to rope some people in with something like that. I think it would be worth a try. I would certainly love to see it happen. His comedies have a lot of manic energy to them, especially his Franco and Ciccio films. Franco and Ciccio were kind of, they were like Abbott and Costello, Sicilian comics. The humor doesn't always translate. It's very topical. It's very political. It's very, it's very relevant to the time. And a lot of the gags just aren't planned. But I think they're interesting films, and I would certainly love to see it happen. I don't know how they would do, and I don't know if anybody's going to take a chance on it, but I hope that somebody will.
I think with Severin's box sets, a good Severin Lucio Fulci comedy box set would do gangbusters. I mean, if they can sell us Adamson and have that go out of print immediately, come on.
Well, I think, they would do, if they would do it, they would be wise to also include something like Young Dracula, which is, that's Fulci in vampire terrain. It's got John Steiner in it. It's got some names that would be, actually Ciccio's in that one as well. Funnily enough, Ciccio and Gracia's in that. You could maybe put in My Sister-in-Law, which is the Edwidge Fenech film that he did, sexy comedy. And The Eroticist, a totally nonsensical title. The original title was something like The Senator Likes Women Despite Public Appearances, which is a very, very stylish, very visually inventive, and I think extremely funny movie that really has a lot to say about Italian politics, Italian kind of gender politics as well, but also the church. It's very, very bitter in its portrayal of the church. So maybe put those 3 films in and add in a couple of the early black and white ones, and maybe you'd have a winner.
And then give us like a Fulci documentary. I'll take my money right now. That'd be incredible. All right. For people that checked out your 5 that you just gave, and now they're looking to get deeper, what are some of your deep cuts, maybe some overlooked titles, something that are just, these are the heart of great Giallo films?
Well, deeper cut movies, I would certainly say one of them for me would be Pupi Avati's film House with the Laughing Windows, which is an incredibly creepy and disturbing film. so far unavailable on Blu-ray, although hopefully something will change with that. Some of
Yeah.
Avati's works are starting to come out, so there may be some hope there for that. It's it's also one of the relatively few regional gialli. It's not a film set in the city. It's set in a very small village community, and deals very much with um, sort of superstition in addition to sort of a series of killings that are going
Yeah.
on. Comes to a very, very memorably creepy finale. I think it's a masterpiece.
Yeah, it's a great movie. I think there's a Shameless DVD that's probably the most common release that people pick up for this one, but Shameless is kind of shameful a lot of the time, so it's not one that I recommend.
They're well named. When they get it right, they get it right, but they very often get it wrong. Um, yeah, not much to really be said about that, but and they often trash their movies up too. They make them look really, really trashy,
Yeah.
which is unfortunate. But Arrow did that too in the beginning. Lest we forget the early days, if anybody remembers the cover for Bay of Blood or Inferno, they threw good taste out the window in the beginning, but they made up for it later.
Yeah, they thankfully have turned it around. What's number 2 on this list?
Well, it's one you've already mentioned. It's my favorite Lucio Fulci film, and really one of the great films of all time for me. One of my top 10 favorite films, Don't Torture a Duckling. Um, when another regional giallo, a film that's again very much rooted in sort of superstition and dealing with class conflict and prejudice and superstition and all these things kind of going on. Lots of kind of barbed commentary about the church and about the authorities and so forth. The movie that was one of the two films Fulci was proudest of. They both starred Tomas Milian. The other one was Beatrice Cenci, which is another movie very much political and very much pointed against the church. He was a man of a very complicated relationship with the Catholic Church, and it's just an amazing piece of work. The most famous, infamous scene in the film, of course, is when a character is brutally beaten to death in a graveyard. Anticipates the opening of the Beyond. There's chain whipping going on, but the use of sound and editing and camera angles and everything, that scene just it's an amazing film.
Yeah, Don't Torture a Duckling is one that kind of changed Giallos for me. By the time I finally saw this, I said, so this is what they can do. Basically, it really elevated the appreciation for these films so much for me, because this is, in my opinion, Fulci's masterpiece. Everything about this is just a breathtaking, immersive experience that is so hard to not have it sit with you for a couple days afterwards, because it's so thought-provoking. I love that movie.
Yeah, I know some people had some problems with the effects at the end, which I get it, but I like the symbolism. I've always found it fascinating, Fulci's sort of fascination with the destruction of the body. Sometimes going even into cartoonish extremes with something like the spider scene in the Beyond, for example. Yes, it's very fake, but at the same time, there's something kind of fascinating about the way he just loves seeing the body being torn to pieces. It very often in slow motion. So the ending, I think, absolutely works. And it's and a great cast too. If you're immersed in these films, it's not a cast that is going to be well known among more mainstream people. But if you're familiar with Italian films of this vintage, you've got people like Tomas Milian, Barbara Boucher, Florinda Balkan. It's a great cast.
Absolutely. All right, getting deeper. What's our number 3?
Trying to think of more kind of offbeat, unusual gialli, and one that comes to mind is a movie that Mondo Macabro put out recently called Hotel Fear or Pensione Paura.
Nice.
Francesco Burilli film, which is a very, very interesting film, another regional film. Believe me, there aren't too many of them, but it's interesting we have 3 in a row like this. And stars the French actor Luc Miranda, who was very popular in Italian films at this time, plays a very nasty kind of proto-fascist character in that film, and a very, very interesting kind of weirdly unsettling film that sneaks up on you. It's a movie of subtlety. It's got a lot of great sort of tactile little touches in it that really kind of immerse you into the film. Sort of set around the time of the Second World War, and it's an offbeat film, very interesting. Not one that's necessarily going to appeal to the body count crowd, perhaps, but I think a very worthwhile movie.
I unfortunately have not been able to see this one yet, so that just intensifies my desire to see it. And from everybody that has picked up this Blue, I've only heard great things. That it was the winner of that bundle. It was
Hmm.
one that people really appreciated. And Mondo Macabro, they are definitely deserving of all of the championing any of us can give because they've brought out some offbeat, wild, off the wall titles for years. Pete
Hmm.
and Jared together, they've got something magical going on because none of the movies are truly, when you put 12 of them together, they're not similar necessarily, but the label has this odd personality that is just like, I know that when their name is on something, I know I'm probably going to love it.
Yeah, not everything they put out necessarily appeals to me. There's certain things I'm like, yeah, I'm good, but a lot of them really do, and I'm very, very grateful to them in particular for diving into some of the Jess Franco stuff they've done, the Paul Naschy stuff they've done, for
Yeah.
example, and some of these other just wonderfully offbeat titles that they've picked up and given really nice additions to. I mean, I was so glad when somebody finally put out a good edition of Devil's Nightmare, for example, which is another one of those early sort of formative Euro cult experiences for
Yep.
me. It used to show on USA Network a lot in the 80s. Um, so nice to finally have that in a really nice edition. Also, Legend of Blood Castle, Blood Ceremony, the Gordy Grau film about, well, not really about Countess Bathory, but sort of based loosely on Countess Bathory. Really excellent film. Um,
Nice.
so yeah, they've done a lot of good stuff.
I realized as we were talking about that I may have miscounted. I don't know if that was number 3 or 4, but I know that we got at least one more left.
I think it was three. So
Okay.
this one, I feel like I have to have a Lenzi in here. So I'm going to go with Orgasmo, which was the first and I
Nice.
think best of his Gialli. He is somebody who did a lot of work in the Giallo genre in general. He did a number of them through the 60s and 70s, and they're all well worth seeing. They're all interesting. They're all kind of radically different from one another. I mean, some of them are closer to the Argento mold than others. This is part of that kind of group of sexy Gialli I was talking about before, about good-looking people being atrocious to one another in beautiful settings. It's very much based on Diabolique, the great Henri Georges Clouzot film from the 50s. So it's a plot film. It's all about trying to drive somebody crazy, but there's a couple really nice twists along the way. A great soundtrack by Piero Umiliani, and good stuff.
This is one that is a part of the wonderful box set from Severin for the Lindsay Baker box set, and it is that box set. I feel like, and I've said this before, but I feel like that is going to be the turning point for Severin. I feel like after from that box set on, they've sort of gotten this air of prestige that everything has just taken this quality leap, and not that they were terrible beforehand, but it seems like they really got in touch with what makes Severin truly great, and that box set was just that specific turning point, and it's so well done. The films they chose for it, mostly all great. Obviously, the Carol Baker of it all, she's incredible, but just a really good choice. Great movie.
Yeah, I was glad that they did that. Obviously, that was the first ever Lenzi set, probably anywhere in the world, actually, that they attempted to
Wow.
do kind of a set specifically devoted to Lenzi. And yeah, it's a good one. All the films in that set are well worth watching. And yeah, they really went all out on it. So they deserve all the high marks they can get for that one.
I agree. All right, let's bring it in for a landing. What is our fifth one for our deep cuts?
Five, I think I'm gonna go with $5 for an August Moon, Mario Bava film, kind of in the Ten Little Indians vein. It's a perversely blood-free film, but at the same time, again, beautiful settings, beautiful cinematography, and extraordinary soundtrack. Piero Umiliani again did one of the great scores for not just any Giallo, but for any film for this movie. It's an amazing soundtrack. It's a movie Bava hated because it was an assignment that he came to late in the day. He had nothing to do with setting it up. He had nothing to do with casting it. So everything was just kind of, given to him. He hated the script.
Right.
He threw it away and improvised the movie. And you can kind of tell because it doesn't always make sense, but it's okay because it's just so beautifully done. And it's a great example of a great director taking a not very good script and making something really interesting out of it. had that been handed to a less inspired filmmaker, I think it would have been a really plotting movie. But the movie that he made certainly is not plotting.
I think the last time I saw this, I had none of that context, not knowing that it was thrown together, so it was very confusing at the time. But knowing that and knowing much more so who Bava is now, it is much richer than if you would, if you saw this as an opening to Giallo film and that was one of your first tastes, you would probably be turned off pretty quickly. So yeah, this is a good deep cut choice, and I think that it's one that is deserving of a nice, really strong release and needs one.
Yeah, they Kino put it out over here, and Arrow did it in the UK, and they did nice enough with it. But there's room for a better version. Hopefully, it'll show up again.
I don't think we've mentioned Vinegar Syndrome at all tonight. How do you feel about their little forgotten Jolly box sets that they've put out so far?
I was involved in the first one. I did a commentary on a movie called Trauma, not to be confused with the Argento film, but it was Leon Klimovsky's last film, the Argentinian film director who did a lot of Paul Naschy's film. It's a really odd film, and actually a movie that significantly improved seeing it again in a better version compared to when I first saw it, when I wrote about it in third volume of The Deadly So Perverse. So again, it's helpful to see these things in good editions. I mean, I thought they were sort of hit and miss as far as collections go. Some of the films were, they were from the shallow end of the pole, let's say. But some of the films were really, really quite good, and I was really glad to see something like Autopsy, for example, or My Dear Killer, another one I think is a really, really good film, getting a release. Forgotten, I don't know about Forgotten. I mean, some of them are fairly well known, so I thought that was slightly odd as a name. But and of course, it gets into the complicated issue too of what is a Giallo and what is not a Giallo, and different people have very different feelings on that particular subject. So, but I thought it was a worthy series, and I hope they do more.
I agree fully. The forgotten part is the only thing that I've ever really had an issue with, because many of these are titles people have been clamoring for years. I wouldn't really call them necessarily forgotten. Last question for you, just so you can have your night back. I always laugh because there's so many people that are quick to say something that comes out in 2022 is like a modern American Giallo or something like that. So often I don't even get the parallels. It seems like sometimes they're just grabbing onto bright colors or something. Are there any films from the last, say, 10 years that you would say really fit the mold of a modern Giallo and really kind of hit all the spots for you that you've enjoyed quite a bit?
I'll give you one that was supposed to be and that wasn't. That was Last Night in Soho, which I saw. I didn't particularly care for, to be honest with you, and I was like, I don't see how this is anything like Giallo. And the colored lighting, okay, yes, you'll get that in Bava. You'll get that to a certain extent with Fulci and Argento, but not so much in a lot of the other films. It's not really, they don't really tend to go, that's really more of an Italian horror thing. That's sort of the Gothic, or like, the Argento, Suspiria, Inferno type thing. So I think that was a bit of a, mishmash, kind of an idea that people latched on. Oh, it's like a Giallo. It really isn't. Over the last few years, something that really got it. I mean, I think, and I didn't like it at first. It took me 2 or 3 viewings to really come to like it, but I really grew to like Berberian Sound Studio. That is admittedly probably closer to like Antonioni felt than it is to a typical Giallo. The typical Giallo is really more of a mainstream kind of slightly trashier movie, so it's not really as sort of ethereal and artsy as all that. But I thought that film got that atmosphere and that kind of feeling of suspense down rather well. So I would certainly point to that one as a good example.
It's a good choice. I'd probably throw out Knife Plus Heart. I think it got the black glove killer aspect. I think that even a lot of the thematic sides of it you could throw in with some of the sexier Giallo at least. It's a really well made movie, and also got a good release from Altered Innocence, the Vinegar Syndrome partner label. Very, very interesting too. Nice modern take, I would say.
Yeah, I'd like to see somebody like Aspar Noé do something in that vein.
Yeah.
I'd love to see him do something like that. He definitely has that capacity for that kind of style. If you look at something like, I feel like the climax is far closer to the remake of Suspiria than the remake that we got, which was an
Yeah.
interesting film, not nearly as good as the original. It was interesting. It was too much. It was too excessive. It was too indulgent. It was far too long, and there was far too much Tilda Swinton for my taste. But at least they took it in a different direction. I could respect that. But I thought the climax was really like, oh, that's closer to what I thought, with the pounding music and the aggressive style and everything, and just kind of unrelenting, just punching you, punching you, punching you. I thought that was far closer to what a really good remake of Suspiria ought to have been. So I'd like to see him do something like that. He's a director kind of rises above any kind of real genre, though. He's almost
Yep.
just a genre unto himself. So I don't see him doing a straightforward. There was talk of Nicholas Winding Refn was going to do or at least produce a remake of What Have You Done to Solange, which is another one of the great Giallo films, Massimo Dallamano's film from 1972. I don't know. I mean, why? If he could do it, if he could do justice to it, then why not? It could be interesting, but I kind of wonder. I don't know how that subject matter would play today.
Right.
It'd be very timely now, certainly with some of the controversy that's going on with Roe v. Wade and all of that. That could be interesting, but I don't know how that would go over. But Noe definitely somebody that I would love to see. If he was going to do something a little bit along those lines, I'd be first one in line to see that.
Yeah, and I agree with you for the most part on Last Night in Soho. I'd honestly love to see Edgar Wright do an all-out horror with his attempt at some of his jump cut editing. I feel like he could do something frenetic and interesting, but I don't know. I feel like he wanted to go there with Last Night in Soho, and just something held him back for some reason.
It's almost like I just always felt like that way with Tim Burton. I mean, back when Tim Burton was still making
Yeah,
decent movies, it was like he was afraid to commit seriously to something. So there was always this kind of jokey thing. Like, Sleepy Hollow has got the look of an Italian Gothic crossed with like a
yep,
Hammer or Roger Corman Poe movie. Some of the visuals are really beautiful. The story's a mess. And the jokey tone just throws me out all the time. It's like, can't you just commit to something? Now he did get closer to that with something like Sweeney Todd, which I thought was more interesting on the whole.
yeah,
Um, but it's like they get the aesthetic aspect right, but they can't quite get the mood or the atmosphere right. I mentioned
no,
the Halloween sequels, the recent Halloween sequels. You can tell that David Gordon Green has studied John Carpenter and studied them very closely, but he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand how to time things. He doesn't have Carpenter's sense of how to time those scares,
yeah.
and how to generate the tension and suspense. There's no suspense in this film.
Got to hold back
Um,
sometimes.
yeah, it's like you get it, your heart's in the right place, but somehow or another you just can't quite add it up quite right and get the right effect.
I agree fully. I'll remind everybody, Make Them Die Slowly, just released. Link for this will be in the description below. So Deadly, So Perverse, I think is still out there to purchase right now, right?
Yeah, all those books should still be, they are technically like, printed on demand. So as long as people want to buy them, they should be available all through Amazon.
I would love an updated hardcover of all three of them in one giant book with some updates.
Yeah, it's tough. You worry about, you don't want people to think you're just being indulgent and ridiculous. And
Right.
I've done two versions of the Bava book, but I still don't feel I got it right. I'd like to go back and do a third, but how many times can you do that before people get pissed off? I'd like to revisit the Fulci to a certain extent as well, and certainly the Giallo books. I would approach it differently now. I would definitely do it differently now than what I did at the time. So I've thought about it to a certain extent, and I'm like, I could theoretically go back and do a slightly different approach and just do a different book on the subject, but I don't know. I'd have to give it some more thought.
That sounds, yeah, I get that it's difficult to ride that line properly. Troy, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredible. I really hope everybody checks out a lot of these recommendations. They were some great picks, and then, not to mention, the entire conversation just went to some of those places that a lot of people won't be willing to talk to. So I'm appreciative of that.
I don't know. I'll find myself being burned in effigy, maybe. But no, it was a lot of fun, and I thank you for having me.
Hopefully you'll come back sometime, and we'll see you next time. Thanks.
Be happy to.